Well, let's begin with some prayer. And I noticed that on Monday nights, at least, you all start your prayer by taking a deep breath. So let's do that. And let's give thanks for a moment now inside ourselves for some things that happened to us today. After that Thanksgiving, let's also be mindful right now and hold up to the light the people we know and the people we don't know who've had a bad day, and ask for God's presence with them. And then let's take a moment to think about a memory at least 10 years ago and hold that in our hearts. If that moment 10 years ago was hard, remember it. If it was great, give thanks. And let's all give thanks for community, the way it makes us bigger, the way it makes us deeper. Amen. Well, the chatter before we were even beginning was all about Thecla. Before we go into Thecla, which we will soon, I want to show you a list of a whole bunch of books from the 1st and 2nd century. And I'm going to bring this on screen. Oops, no, that's not the one I want to bring on screen. Up there it was. Let me go again. Here we go. So this is just a list that I made that I thought that since we are now in our 4th week together, our almost 4th week together, we just noticed, first of all, that we've studied the Gospel of Mary, we've studied the prayer of thanksgiving, the Thunder Perfect Mind, but that's a part of a bigger list, and it's part of what I call basically the larger family of early Christian texts. You'll see on your left, there is right there at the top, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Then right below is Clement I, which was a letter. This was a letter that we've never lost. And it actually came from the 1st century, but did not eventually make it into the canon. Then there's the Demonstration of Apostolic Teachings by Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a 2nd century author, known primarily for trying to chase down heretics. But on the other hand, Irenaeus, for me, is one of my favorite authors because he was the first person to say that there should be only 4 gospels. He was in the 2nd century, and he knew that there was 20-some gospels at that time, but he proposed 4, and he proposed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the coolest thing for me about that is that he chose 4 gospels, not because they had all the same message, because he wanted a reading for all people that would be that would show what the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 winds that blow were. In other words, Irenaeus, when he chose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it wasn't because they agreed, but it was because they were 4 winds that blow and 4 corners of the earth. Then looking down at the Diary of Perpetua, just at the beginning of the 3rd century, this is probably a real diary. We don't have much real diaries, but the Diary of Perpetua was of her diary right before she was brought into the arena and killed. She was a mother and a daughter, and lived at the age of probably the mid to high 30s, and she was killed in the arena for saying that she was a Christian. Then you have down books that you may know more: Hebrews, James, and then there is James, the first revelation of James. The first revelation of James is a whole bunch of stories about people who died. It has the story of Jesus dying and the story of James dying and others. So this was kind of a martyrology. Then the next one down is the infancy gospel of James. So this is a gospel that only has Jesus's infancy in it. Then there's the second revelation of James. This also is more dying. Then you see down there the Gospel of John and the Revelation to John. And then up on the next line in, the third letter of John and the letter of Jude, the letter and the Gospel of Luke. All of these are in the canon, of course. And then you have the letter of the martyrs of Lyon. That's a very gruesome set of stories about people who were tortured to death by the Romans. Well, I'm going to stop here, and you just notice how big this list is. This is only 54 on the list, but just for you to know that if you thought studying these 4 texts in 3.5 weeks was a lot, look at all of the stuff you have yet to read. So let's just stop for a moment and see if you have anything to say about what it's like to think about the new texts that could be read and the ones that you have read. Just take a moment to reflect on that and see what thoughts you have about the whole idea of new texts outside of the Bible from the most ancient times. Yes.
Chuck, I see you've raised your hand. Unmute yourself and you can ask a question if you've got one.
This is a very boring question, but what did the PS in front of a few of
Thank you. Pseudo.
pseudo? Didn't you have that in front of one of the Gospels?
Yes.
Which one is pseudo?
What that means, it was named for someone who didn't write it.
Okay.
Yeah, and there were a lot of PSs there.
Yes, there were. And I couldn't make it into canon, and I couldn't make it into New Testament. I couldn't do that.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things about all of the namings is, as I've alluded before, basically a lot of the names of the texts themselves are pseudo, not just the authors, but the names. It's I alluded to this in one of our weeks, but not very directly. The authors of the ancient world did not like titles at all, and they didn't like their names on what they wrote. So most of what we have as titles and authors are relatively odd, and they probably were basically the names of the texts themselves were probably given by the typists, the ones who typed it, because basically if you're a professional scribe, you've got 2 or 3 things going at the same time, and sometimes you mix up what you're doing. So they always had to scribble and make up a name and scribble it at the top.
And can I add on to my question? Something I read, I think, for this group, talked about the Diary of Perpetua.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But it's not included in the New Testament. So when something tickles your fancy, and do we find it on Google? What do we do?
Yeah, great question. Google is really great. I would say most of these texts, all 150 that have been discovered recently, they're very easily found generally. So the Diary of Perpetua, you would find at least 3 or 4 translations of it. And I thought you were going to ask, so what books did we add and what didn't we? And that chapter, that was really a wonderful process. And I think you all know, but you may not, that I basically, I got Houghton, Mifflin, and Harcourt to bankroll this, of me asking 20 different famous spiritual leaders around the country to join me for a year and look at 75 texts and choose some of them to add to the New Testament. And one of those people, one of those nationally known spiritual leaders, was your own pastor. So I asked Bruce to do that, and Bruce spent a year with us looking at 75 texts, and then these 20 people, and the list is in the book if you have the book. The list, we got a number of bishops, a number of famous authors. We had almost half people of color and half women. We got together a lot, and we fought a lot because it was a hard choice. Well, so let's get to Thecla.
There's a question.
Oh yes, go ahead.
Vita has a question.
Please.
You're
Very
muted.
quickly, Elaine Pagels is not on that list, and I was surprised because I have read some of her work and actually have seen her speak at Stanford, a long time ago. So
Yeah, she's a dear friend.
just too busy,
Um,
or what?
she turned me down.
Oh,
She was too busy. Um, but yeah, she and I have had doctoral students together, and I'm surprised that I haven't said this in the last month, but I think she single-handedly is the person who got the entire world to start reading the newly discovered text. The Gnostic Gospels was the thing that popped open the possibility that all of these newly discovered texts weren't just junk. And it was her. She did that book in very early in her tenure, and she did it against all of her scholars. And I just think she's an extraordinary historical hero. Okay, well then let's jump into Thecla for a little bit. And I know that it sounds like, well, let me ask how many of you read the whole thing? Some of you, let's see, I'm not seeing how exactly many that is. Yeah, pretty many, huh? Okay, good. Thank you. Well, just to say, and Don and I were saying this right beforehand, but Thecla, the Acts of Paul and Thecla is one of the only books that we put in a New Testament that didn't ever get lost. In other words, we think it was written probably in the early 2nd century, and but it was never lost. It was not only not lost, but it was famous almost from the very beginning. Am I hearing someone trying to get a question in? Not sure. So this is a primary book for the ages. It's clear that by the end of the 2nd century, a number of leaders were trying to stop people from reading it, but it was so popular, and they were trying to. It was actually Irenaeus, who I was just mentioning, tried to stop people from reading the Acts of Paul and Thecla because she had baptized herself in the story, as you may have noticed. But that didn't stop anybody. And you'll find all over the world people who know Thecla very well. And especially women have known in the Middle Ages, you'll find lots of women knowing Thecla. Even in the 19th century, there was a huge movement about Thecla in Syria, mainly by nuns, and these nuns were trying to find a way into the world to be teachers, and they named themselves after Thecla because she was so courageous. So anyway, that's a little snapshot. Who wrote the Acts of Paul and Thecla? We do not know. We do know that she was so famous that by the 5th century, there were all kinds of other books about her. But this is probably the earliest book about her. I'm going to be quite interested in her drama of not wanting to get married and leaving home. We'll want to, I think carefully about this. And what I want to suggest early on is that probably one of the main reasons that she was so famous is there were so many women and young men that were leaving home. And what I want to suggest in the wake of a number of my scholarly colleagues, it looks like home was really hard in the first 2 centuries, partly because of Roman terror, but partly because the role of the homes was highly patriarchal, and if you were a woman that didn't get married, you basically ended up being a slave for your extended family. Similarly, if you were a son and didn't get married, or if you were a son, not the firstborn son, you had a good chance of also staying at home in your extended family and being a servant who got no pay. So in other words, one of the things that we may see some of in the story is she as the hero of that class of people in the 1st and 2nd century. Let's look at the first page of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And I want to have us take a little look at this in pages 5 and 6. If you would look at pages 5 and 6, these are a set of Beatitudes. And if you have it with you, I'll ask someone to read a couple of the Beatitudes in chapter 5. And you'll have to unmic yourself.
I have it in front of me.
Thank you.
Do you have a place to start?
I would say, yes, start in chapter 5, where it says, as Paul said.
Right. As Paul said, "Blessed are the clear of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are those who observe purity in flesh, for they will become a temple of God. Blessed are the self-possessed, for God will speak to them. Blessed are those who set themselves apart from this world, for they will please God. Blessed are those who have wives, as if they do not, for they will be heirs of God." Blessed
Thank
are
you.
those in, okay. I'm not
That's
sure
good.
I got that rhythm quite right on that last one.
Yeah, no, but that's so here I want you to notice already that these Beatitudes are focusing a lot on family life, and especially on what one might call celibacy. And here, of course, we don't know what Paul's actual relationship to this story was. He's not positioned as an author, but we need to talk about what kind of character he was, and we will do that eventually. But what we're noticing here is that he is a teacher about this social problem that I've been saying. That is, he seems to be very interested in people not marrying and people being interested in not having what one might call a family life, so that I think that reads basically not getting married. Here's a question for you all to see how much we need to think this through. Do you know in the writings of Paul any place else that Paul talks like this? Yes, Vida?
And I may be completely wrong, but something about it's better to marry than to burn, essentially, with with sexual desire. I
Yeah,
don't know
totally.
exactly where it comes from, but
Yeah, no, very, very nice. You got exactly where I wanted us to land, and you don't have to look at this, but that's 1 Corinthians 7. It's an entire chapter about whether to get married or not. And it looks like in Corinth, where he's writing this, there are women who are starting to unmarry, not divorce, but simply. So, for instance, you would see in 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about women and men who are starting to be married but not have sex. In other words, as this said in this thing that Don just read, to marry as if you're not married. Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 7 says, I am not getting married. And then he says, of course, if you gotta get married, it's better to marry than be burned. And we don't quite know what that means. That might mean don't be horny, or you don't. That might be what burn means, or it might mean some kind of punishment. But he says over and over again in that chapter, probably best not to be married. And it's quite clear in the way he says that a number of his community are already doing that. So then let's talk. I'm turning to the next page. We don't have to do this page by page, but then with the drama, of course, of Paul and Thecla is mainly Thecla. So Paul is teaching in her hometown, and she is listening to him through the window. She's not going out, but she basically falls for what he is saying. We don't hear what he's saying, so we never get what she was attracted to until we just watch her, and that is, we watch her basically go out the door to follow Paul. And she already has a betrothed. And she rejects his wanting her. He even says, listen, I really love you. And she says, no way am I going to marry you. And it's not because she dislikes him, it's because she has been convinced that what Paul says is the best way. And very quickly, as you notice, Paul is accused all around of trying to get the young people to leave home and not marry. So this ends up with both Paul and Thecla by the third page of chapter, they're both in jail. And their lives are being threatened. Finally, the authorities decide to just kick Paul out of the city. But they decide to keep Thecla, and they threaten that they're going to kill her. So let's just stop there and talk a little bit about that dimension of the story. Let's stop for that. So we've got basically a picture of Paul's primary message being about the evils of marriage and family, and the way Thecla, despite all threats to her, buys into it and starts to follow it as best she can. So, what are your questions and thoughts about this part of the story? Yes, Vida.
I seem to be talking too much, but there's certainly a very big difference between the way a man is treated and a woman is treated for essentially the same issue. And this is a side note, but I loved the description of Paul that was way earlier in the third page or so. A man small in stature with a bald head and crooked legs, healthy with withered eyebrows. I never have seen any such a slightly long nose, I don't remember anywhere else in the Bible such a physical description.
It's
but
the
yeah,
only
to the side, but just
no, that's very much the case. That's the only description we have of him.
Mm-hmm. But do we have such detailed descriptions of anybody else? I mean, we know Goliath was a giant, but they didn't talk about more details as far as I know.
Right. And to that very end, what did you think of how he looked?
Not all that attractive, frankly.
Right.
He's a great talker because he didn't have the looks.
And we'll get to this, but see, I think that description of him may not have been very kind, because as you know from the rest of the story, his relationship to Thecla is kind of weird. And we'll get to some of that, but so it feels to me that this story is really about Thecla primarily, and we'll have to have some discussion as the evening goes on as to what we think of the relationship between the two. Let's see. Are there any
other hands raised?
Good. Thank you.
Chuck and Ellen, you've got your hand raised. Ellen, why don't you go first? Unmute yourself.
My question was, what is wrong with Paul? Doesn't he realize that his any followers, the circle is not going to last long if he doesn't allow marriage?
Yeah. That's exactly the right question, Ellen. I think you're really quite near the heart of it. I think this picture of Paul is that he is not worried about building Christianity. In other words, his idea is not to make a big following. He's more concerned about what's happening to the people, and to certain kinds of people, And here again, we don't know. We only have this one chapter in 1 Corinthians where he talks about his own sexuality and what he thinks. And there he shows himself as being a little bit more nuanced than in this book. In other words, in 1 Corinthians, he does say, I know a bunch of you women are not wanting to be married or sort of only partially be married and be celibate. But marriage isn't all bad. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians. But in other words, that's about as good as Paul gets on marriage in the Bible. But here, it feels fairly thorough. That what he understands himself to be called to do is save the kids. I mean, save the kids from family. In other words, so here the next thing we would ask is, what's going on in the family? And what a number of historians are saying is there's so many stories from other sources that say it's really hard to be in these extended families if you're at the bottom end of the family. If you're a woman and not married, or if you're a man and not married, you end up being more or less the help in the family.
So his pool of followers is only those on the bottom rung in their family.
Yeah, exactly, in their family, and he's the way we were trying to read it is that he cares for them, and that's not contradicted in his letters, but it's not near as emphasized as here.
And Chuck, you raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself? You're still muted, Chuck.
Okay. I'd like to try coming at this from a slightly different direction and see what happens.
Please.
It seems the thesis that I'm exploring, especially because of this work, is that this is really about a redefinition of what it means to live. I go back to Galatians, the famous section in which Paul says, to be a Jew or not to be a Jew doesn't make any difference whatsoever. To be a woman or a man, that doesn't make any difference whatsoever. To be a slave or to be free, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. What he strikes at there are some of the key or fundamental parts of what it meant to live at that time in the first century. Now, it seems to me we're seeing an extension of that in the story about Paul and Thecla. It doesn't make any difference to be married or not. This is really about, and Jesus, to some extent, I would have made the same argument about, but I don't want to go on and on and on. This is about living, how to live, and the previous constraints that society imposes on living are of no consequence.
Yeah, I think there's lots to that, Chuck. That helps a lot to give some other options and to see them alongside of one another. The other thing that we might want to think of right in contact with what you're saying is the high population in Paul's letters of women, especially women who are widows. So Paul has this big concern for widows and even gives them special jobs or special roles in his communities. So I think there also we would add to your list, it doesn't matter whether you're widowed or not. It matters how you live.
Well, I could extend that by looking at the way we live today. I could make another set of conjunctions in which I would say it doesn't make any difference whether you've got a job, that you go to the office or not. That doesn't make any difference. I could go on and on. That part of the argument between groups of people today is really about how to live, and they dress that up with various theses, if you want to call it that, but we still don't know how to live, and we won't follow Christ's advice, and neither does the church. The church doesn't talk about how to live. It talks about salvation, and we should all be kind to each other. Well, being kind to each other is about living, but it doesn't really center on the fact that a great deal of our lives are artificial. It doesn't make any difference. Sorry, I'm on a hobby horse.
No, let me ask you, let me follow that up on one thing just in terms of our time, because I was just noticing our time is a downswing with people getting married. In other words, when you see in our society, it feels to me like a bunch of the younger people that I am with are saying, married or not is not my question. Rather, what does my life mean? And there are lots of people younger who are saying, I have to figure out the meaning of life first. Before I decide whether I'm going to be a part of a family.
And there's a lot of older people who wonder if their lives have really been worthwhile. What does my life mean? Well, I've got children, and I have a business, and I have a legacy, but those are all artificial things. They're aspects of life that happen the way we live, but they're an outcome. They're not a purpose. Seems to me this whole letter raises issues about what it means to live a meaningful life. How would you know that you're living a meaningful life or not?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Well, let's go a little further. So I'm now going to ask us to look at this one text while Paul is in jail, and you may remember, and so this is chapter 18, and I'll read it out loud to you. And so Paul's been thrown in jail. Thecla is on the loose. But in the night, Thecla took off her bracelets and gave them to the gatekeeper. And the door was opened for her. So in other words, she bribed the gatekeeper to jail. She went into the prison and gave the jailer a silver mirror. So she's got the next stage in, because she wants to see Paul no matter what. She went into Paul and sat at his feet, and she heard the great things of God. And Paul feared nothing, having rights to the freedom of God. And Thecla strengthened her trust, kissing his chains. All right, what do we make of this? So in other words, she's on the loose now. She's basically broken loose from family, more or less for good. She comes back one more time. or really 2 more times. And Paul, and she comes to Paul mainly to hear the great things of God. So as I read this, here's what I see in that. It looks like what Paul is saying to these young people is God's got you. God will help you. God will help you. Even if you have to leave home, God is on your side. And so, and by the way, I'll tell you this in advance. The second time that Paul that Thecla gets in front of the arena, she is being challenged by the governor about why in the world she is out there acting like this. All she has to do is get married and she'll be okay. And then he yells at her, the governor yells at her and calls her, she says, why are you doing this, slave of God? In other words, he knows that her group's name is now the slaves of God. So that fits with this chapter here, in which she also it's about God, and it's about having a relationship on God's terms, not the family's terms. But now the final verse here is crazy interesting to me. So Paul's not afraid of anything, and Thecla is strengthened in her trust, and she's kissing his chains. So along the way, when you read this story, one has to say, is this, what kind of relationship do they have? And we'll unfold that a bit, but we can't forget her kissing his chains. In other words, that sounds pretty erotic to me, although I haven't kissed any chains myself. What do you make of any parts of this chapter 18? Or what questions do you have? All right, if we don't have any takers on that, I will.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
What would be the deal of a woman going into a prison?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that would be unusual at that time.
Yeah, especially bribing her way in, acting as if she's got a plan. She wants to see him and it keeps this discussion going. And she figures out how to break in to jail. Betty, this question can't be bigger. It's totally out. In other words, again, we have to sort of catch our breath in this story time and time again. So this is a well entitled, full of moxie young woman, and this would be totally uncommon. It's not even close to being anywhere near average or normal. So your question is exactly right. And by this time, if you're in the ancient world and you hear this story, you think, "Whoa, what kind of woman is this?" Any takers on kissing chains? Okay. Yes, Vida?
Well, in the next chapter, it mentions that, The gatekeeper tells on her, and they go and find her, and found her bound in affection. In other words, Paul is bound by an actual chain. She is bound to him in affection. Or
Right. Absolutely.
Is it affection for Paul? Is it affection for the words that he is saying? Is it affection for God? Yeah, I wondered about that.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me as if, so let's take on Paul then, Paul and Thecla, and who they are together. She seems to show regular affection for him. She thinks that he is her teacher. But I mean, for me, this chapter 18 is beyond affection for just a teacher. It's the only sexual, if you would call it that, contact they have in the whole story. But she keeps coming back to him to pray with him and the like. But he doesn't treat her very well. So as you may have noticed, the several big things about his relationship from her side is he will say once in a while, like the first time that the government tries to kill her and burn her to death, he's out of town. And she says, why were you standing up for me? And he says, well, we were praying. And then they have a meal together. But still, then the second time, when they go to another city together, when she's on the street, they're on the street together. They've just arrived in town, and the head of the town council or the city council sees her on the street and falls in love with her and says, I gotta have her. And so the city council president says to Paul, hey, listen, I'll pay you for her if I can just have her. And Paul says, she's not mine. And he walks away. And then she clobbers the city council president and knocks his crown off. And then he throws her in jail. And she is then brought to the arena the next day. And then along the way, one other thing that Paul does is she says, listen, the main thing I really would like to have before I'm a teacher and a healer like you, because that's what I want to be, is that I be baptized. And Paul puts her off and acts as if, yeah, it'll happen sometime. So exactly what she needs spiritually, he declines. But he and she meet each other from time to time for her entire life. And of course, the last chapter says that they're buried nearby to each other. So, in other words, I guess, and I want you all's take on this. Yeah, let's have somebody. What do you think of this relationship? I just laid the whole thing out in the story between them. What do you think
Hall's
about
been
it?
having his hand up. I don't know if what you have to ask John fits in with this or not. And Ellen's got her hand raised.
That was only to point out that John had his raised.
Okay, all right. And John's.
And Mary Alice looks on the verge of a question.
All right. Well, this all takes a little bit of time to take in. So let's, because we don't. Oh, let's see.
Evan had a question.
Okay, good.
Evan, you have to unmute yourself.
I took that in chapter 18 about kissing his chains, not as erotic, but as a symbol of her welcoming bondage as he was bound.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the impression that she welcomes punishment.
Yeah. The thing that is a little bit different there, I'm trying to find the next place. She has gone to the stranger in prison, and they went, as he told them, and found her bound in affection. They went out from there, from that place, and drew together a crowd, and they declared to the governor what had happened. So, and then, and Paul was ordered to be brought to the court. Thecla wallowed in the place where Paul taught as he sat in the prison. That could be she's still stuck on prison, but this is in 20, Evan, the first part of 20, that she wallows in effect in the place where where Paul taught, so as he was in prison. It could be also that this is just simply she's completely devoted to what he's saying to her. It seems pretty expressive, I guess I would say. Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into the arena situation, which I think is just absolutely wild. Of course, there we have her being stripped and thrown to the beast, and the first thing that basically happens in that is that the lioness kills the lion so that the lion won't kill Thecla. So notice that this is very gender intense. In other words, this has even got the lionesses versus the lion in this as a characterization of what the story is. Then, in the same thing, in the same scene, I don't know whether you noticed this, but this is stunning, the way the women in the arena start fighting for her. And I don't know whether you noticed, but basically the women basically start throwing perfumed flowers into the arena, which makes all of the animals fall asleep. So again, this story is metaphorical, at least, I think, in terms of the way it tells the story, but it's very conscious of women and her. And then the final section of that, before the governor starts yelling at her, calling her the slave of God, is when they throw her in this pool. And it says of the translation here is really, we don't know what it means, because it says man or human eating seals. So we don't know what that animal is, but she's thrown in this pit of water with them, and God saves her by hitting the water with lightning and killing all of the seals. And then since she's in the water and thinks, boy, I really have got to get baptized, she baptizes herself. So this is, and then just to finish off the arena, you all remind her, when she is endangered again in the arena, this queen that has been watching her and took care of her the night before, she faints, and that makes the governor be really afraid that he's going to get in trouble with the emperor because the queen has fainted. And then the governor releases her to the house of the queen who has been fainted. Now that's a pretty big set of dramas. Tell me what you have as thoughts and questions about this big scene. Let's see if I can see all of your. Okay, Evan.
Is this similar to any other stories of martyrs? Are there lots of stories of martyrs, and how much of this is typical?
Yeah, great question. There are a lot of scenes like this in a lot of books. Most of them are later than this. But yeah, this is a lot of fanciful storytelling. The difference, of course, is in almost all the other stories, the people, and there are a lot of women that, in contrast to the other things we were saying about women, there are a lot of women that are killed in the arena in stories. But here, the difference between most of the martyrological stories and this is that she doesn't want to be killed. Most of the men and women who go into the arena saying, I'm going to die, and I want to die. And she doesn't want to die. She wants to get back to work being a teacher and a healer. And God protects her, and that's what she turns out to do. So yeah, Evan, you've got the spirit of this kind of storytelling. But I'd love to hear what you all are making of her in the arena, if there are thoughts or questions.
Well, I have a question, and I may be off track, but the whole book from beginning to end seems like a huge power struggle.
Yeah.
For control.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally.
And it's just, it just jumps off the page as you read it. Mm-hmm. You go from one power struggle to another. It can be in the family. It describes huge power struggles.
In the family, her mother and her fiance bring her to and ask that she be killed.
Right. Right. And so, to me, this Thecla is is the main character. And
by far, yeah, by
yeah,
far, yeah.
She's the main character, and she is one determined, hard-headed, wild woman, and she's a huge threat to the power structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of the government, of the family, male versus female. Husbands, wives. She knows she does not want to be dominated in a marriage situation.
Right? Yeah.
In those days, in first century, and for many centuries to follow, women were dominated in a marriage.
And women didn't go out of their way to challenge their being dominated.
Women were starting to follow Thecla and rally for her, and she became an even greater threat.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
People in her position were up against being dominated either by a husband or by the family.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So they naturally would seek a third way of living.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So and as you open that window, Ellen, I want to say, so what we do know is that there are a lot of women's communities as well at that time, in the name of Christ or in the name of God. I think they would say more, and that is a stunning thing to happen in such a patriarchal way. I mean, this is the Roman Empire is where the emperor himself says, "I'm your daddy" to every family. And he's full of over and over again. They're full of violence. Yes, so this is extraordinary. In other words, now we're beginning to see why this is really one of the most famous stories in Christianity. And by the way, one of the really interesting things about that, just as a sidebar, is that she was mostly a Catholic hero. I mean, she wasn't Catholic, of course. Catholicism didn't happen, but it was within Catholic circles that her fame rose most quickly. It's only within the last 40 or 50 years that most Protestants even start to know her story.
Gail, go ahead.
I was going to say she used all her powers. I mean, she obviously had great physical attributes. The men just fell off their thrones for her. So and when she took her clothes off, they went wild. And then she was just so open to knowledge, and she was very she was growing and progressing, and she had that power. And then she was very spiritual, and she was not fearful, but she believed in the life ever after by baptizing herself. So she was a very spiritual person too. She had the whole package in many ways. There's a lot of I go back to Thunder too, the whore, the virgin, and all of that kind of thing, which is not either or. People are not either or. There's the linear connections too, and the circles around all of it. So her journey seemed inward and outward to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And again, the fact that when a story does this in such active anti-Roman scenes, that even triples the courage that you have. In other words, you are an active heroine of against all that is powerful. So let's talk. So getting a little bit beyond that great scene in the arena, then she goes to the house of Tryphena, the queen, and it's fairly clear that Tryphena, the queen, is her financial patron. In other words, there's not much left of the Thecla story after this happens, but what does make it clear, or what is made clear, is that that she then settles into the role of a public teacher and a public healer. In other words, she doesn't go off and find a hermitage. What she does for the rest of her life is to, in public, heal and teach. And it's somewhat subtle in this, but it's more or less clear that she does that with big time help from Tryphena, who and I think you may have noticed that Tryphena's attachment to her is partly because Tryphena's daughter has died, and so she claims Thecla as her own. But Thecla won't stay at home for anybody. So she's out on the road most of the time. This also, again, is just to say it a little bit more thoroughly, in the end of the 2nd century, and this is probably written at the first part of the 2nd century, but by the end of the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, you have people who, in the face of the Roman power and violence, the main stories are of people who die for their freedom. But she actually continues to be active. One of the last stories of her in the 5th century makes her a martyr, just because that's what they think that has to happen in a good story. But in the original story, she will have nothing of that. Thoughts and questions?
May I once again? I was intrigued by, in chapter 40, it seemed to me that she was dressing herself as a man.
Yes.
Is this what she had to do to get people in other cities and all to pay attention? She bound herself up, which I'm assuming means flattened her breast,
right,
and stitched together her garment, a robe in the fashion of a man's, and then departed for Myrna. And she's also looking for Paul. So I was interested in, among all these travels and teaching, was she then perceived as a woman, as a man, or as something in between?
Oh, so good, Vina. So really helpful. Yes. So this is really part of this larger phenomenon that's happening, is you can't be in public alone without having what happened to her the first time happen over and over again. So yes, cutting your hair, dressing like a man is the way to be in public as a woman. So So this is quite clear that Thecla is a part, by the 3rd century, Thecla is the example for women to do that. So this is simply what happens. And yes, I guess, I mean, I do a lot of gender studies of the ancient world, and a lot of my colleagues and I are saying this really is the construction of a new gender. In other words, this is an active building of her identity in which she accepts herself as a different kind of human. And we know that there are all kinds of other women that did the same. So this is the construction of a new gender in an image of the Christ people. And so this is the next stage in what I was saying earlier. Men and women basically reject their regular gendered identity. So they're like Paul, there are a lot of men that are also freeing themselves from the difficulties of family and simply being a healer and a teacher. But the women have it much harder. And so they have to actively construct, both the men and the women, but mostly the women, to be something other than a woman or a man. So you're right on there, I think. It's so fascinating to me.
To me, that seems like being a nun.
She is the most... Yes, I was actually going to get to that, Evan. Yes. So nuns' clothes, the first kinds of nuns' clothes, come out of this drama. In other words, that's what we see in very early situations happening to women's communities. They don't quite look like what women are supposed to look like. And they claim a place in the public square. So yes, nun is the name of these people by the end of the 3rd century. Yep. But it takes, I want to say that there are hundreds of Theclas at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century. And they come together into some communities, and some they have this courageous life of a lone, I would say, queer person constructing their own genders in public. But yes, we can't underestimate how much this had to do with what I would say also, even now in our day, the 3rd gender of nuns. I mean, I taught for 10 years at a Catholic college owned by nuns, and some of my best friends are nuns, and they say all the time, we're a different gender, and we're doing it for God. The final scene, or the next of the final, was there someone else ready to jump in? Because I want you to see the final, I think, fairly ironic scene of her life here in it's in 40. It's in 44, I think. Yes, it's in 44. But certain ones in the city, Greeks by religion and doctors by profession, sent violent young men to her to ruin her. So basically, you've got the last scene before her death is a rape gang headed after her. She is a maiden and serves Artemis, they said. Because of this, she has power with healing. Look at this drama of what is happening here. And by God's foresight, she entered into a rock alive, and it descended under the earth. And she left for Rome to see Paul and found him sleeping, dead. And after staying there a little while, she slept with a beautiful sleep, and she is buried about 2 or 3 stadia from the tomb of her teacher Paul. But you see here that basically the story never gives her an easy life. So even towards the end of her life, they are so afraid of her power and her healing that they go after her to rape her.
We have a question from Suchitra, who's waving, but you have to unmute yourself before you can be heard.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, I have a question. So these women were treated like eunuchs, right? These questions.
Can you hear
Sue?
Can you hear
me? Can you?
Yes, I can.
They were treated like eunuchs, right?
Yes.
And so, and also, were they allowed to have any education or anything that makes them have their own mind to think, so that they could think for themselves?
I didn't hear that last question.
Also, were they allowed to have any education so that they could think for themselves?
Any
education?
Education.
No.
They were not allowed to have education.
No. That, well, at least there's no. In this story, there's not. I think by the time the women's community is built, they start reading. But in this early stage, and I love the way you've noticed how similar that is to eunuchs.
Yeah.
This is, and just from our conversation last week, I suspect that you know this, that in the ancient world, it's the likes of Thecla and the likes of eunuchs, which are the people who build a new gender.
Okay. Yeah.
And who shape themselves differently so that they can be true to who they are. And so the way she has to live in public, afraid of rape and looking like a man, that is a courageous regendering of her. And again, with all of this, I frankly can't help but think of so much courage in our day for the way young people are rethinking who they are gender-wise at such great cost. So thank you so much for, I have entire sessions on the eunuchs that I do. So you're right on about this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Likewise. Anybody want a last something to say? Question? Yes, Evan.
It looks like 44 and 45 seem like two alternative endings.
Oh. Well, yes, that's exactly where she's buried is different.
It seems that she disappears into a rock and then goes with Paul, and that seems to happen when she's been a target of a rape attempt, and then the other ending, she's a 72-year-old woman when she dies.
Right, although I think her lore never has her dying younger. So I think both of these are relatively old Theclas. Okay. And 45 does a little bit of repeating her whole life. But I do think, yes, I would suspect that 44 and 45 have been rewritten several times to say different things.
What's the importance of the 24th of September? That just sort of jumps out as a specific in the middle of almost an allegory.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, yet another time in these 4 weeks in which I have no clue.
Is there a saint's day for her?
There is. Oh no, she's a saint. Yeah, she's a saint in both the Eastern and Western Church.
John, unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
I was just going to say that that's probably her saint's day, and that's the reason that it was included.
Oh, good thought. It had not occurred to me, John. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Often the day of martyrdom rather than the day of birth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's great. Well, it's great to be with you all, and thanks for your enthusiasm about this story. I can tell you're cooking. So, thanks again, and my best to all of you in this wonderful church setting.
Yeah, show your applause and thumbs up, and on behalf of the church and Bruce, thank you so much for doing this. Boy, it just seemed like a nice story until we dive into it, and there's a lot to it, and
isn't there?
We all got to read it again.
Yeah.
Well, and there's so many more books.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way
so
we started.
Many more texts. Boy.
Yeah.
It'll keep me going for a long time.
Super.
Thank you, Hal.
Likewise.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hal.
You.